Well, after such a warm introduction, I feel there's almost nothing left to say. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you. First, I'd like to thank Anne and Jerome and the AGA for inviting me to speak today and for giving me the opportunity to convey some of my thoughts and experiences dealing with a subject that many of you are familiar with, but perhaps from a different perspective. Speaking about ethics, most keynote speakers I've found on that subject are individuals who themselves were involved in behavior which was of a dubious ethical nature, and then after having been ensnared in the judicial system, saw the light and realized the errors of their ways, and have now formed a career giving presentations on ethics. Some of them take it very seriously and some less seriously. I know that Frank Abagnale spoke to you all in the past, and he's one for whom I have a lot of respect, because although he did go through the judicial system, he has maintained a sense of humor, and his book and his film demonstrate it. In my case, my experiences come not from having crossed the line, but rather from a very unique perspective, I would propose. As an FBI agent, I had the opportunity not just to observe a variety of different worlds and cultures, but to actually insinuate myself and become part of these cultures. And in the course of this presentation, I will talk about some of the different cases I worked and some of the different worlds which I came to inhabit as a result of the work I did, and also how my perception of black and white, of good and evil, and the gray area in between has evolved over a few decades as a result of the work that I did, primarily the work that I did as an FBI agent. But I will start by talking a little bit about my background, and you've heard about my background already to a certain extent, but in order to give an idea of where I was coming from in terms of my belief system as to what is right and what is wrong, and how it evolved over the course of years. Initially, my first serious job out of law school was on the staff of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which some of the older ones of you will remember was one of the true statesmen and a great senator from New York State. And although initially disappointed by the legislative process and what I found to be very, not quite corruption, but close to it. And this is back a few years. Winston Churchill is attributed with saying something to the effect that there are two things that one does not want to be aware of, too familiar with. One is how sausages are made, and the other is how laws are made. And as I learned at the tender age of 21, it's not a pretty process, but it was very advantageous to have this education so early in my career, because I was rapidly disillusioned as to the nature of celebrity. I was around a lot of high-profile individuals. But Moynihan, on the other hand, was a true statesman and provided an excellent role model for me. And I point that out to all of you, because many of you are in very senior positions, and much as Moynihan was a role model for me both as to ethics and all other areas of endeavor, you have the opportunity to be role models for your subordinates back at the organizations that you come from. And I suggest that you take that role with great importance, because the moral leadership that you provide will trickle down to your employees. I had the good fortune as well of working in Moynihan's office with another individual whom you may be familiar with, two actually. One was Tim Russert, who came to be on NBC's Meet the Press for many years. He was the host of Meet the Press, and he and I sat with 4 or 5 other people in the same crowded office in the Russell office building. And Tim had a great sense of humor and made politically incorrect jokes from time to time, which I'm not sure I can repeat to this audience and then be without risk of not being invited back in the future. Also, a role model in that office was Elliott Abrams, who was Deputy Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and has also come to be known in the government circle. So I had the benefit of 3 major role models early on. But after a couple of years in Washington, I realized that I perhaps wasn't cut out for lawmaking, and I went to law school. And at law school, my black and white perception of the world was essentially reinforced. So much as you as accountants see there's a correct and an incorrect solution to each problem. There's no, my understanding of accounting is that there's no gray area. Either it's right or it's wrong. And as a law student applying legal analysis to problems, I perceived the same thing, that either there was a right, correct solution or an incorrect solution. I carried that on to when I became a prosecutor. My step after law school, I decided I did not want to go back to Washington, and I went to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, and I became a prosecutor. So following this is the young prosecutor in the middle. May be hard to recognize, but there he is, self-satisfied and complacent, knowing that he's putting the bad guys in jail and that he's one of the good guys, one of the people who wears the white hats. And after 4 years, I saw that many of my colleagues, my other assistant DA colleagues, were leaving the DA's office to go work for law firms, and they would complain about how boring their lives had become since they left the DA's office. And my nature was such that I did not want to leave an exciting job for a boring job. I wanted to leave an exciting job for a more exciting job. Additionally, my perception was, and I think it's altered over the years, but I didn't want to be a defense attorney because I felt that as a defense attorney, I would be helping the bad guys. And that was not consistent with my perception of myself. So instead, I joined the FBI. And it took a year. I had to jump through a lot of hoops, and eventually was accepted as an FBI new agent and went to training at Quantico, just like on television. And so I went from after a period of time, I went from the well-groomed agent that you see, prosecutor that you see there, and now flash forward to a few years later, maybe 5 years later, and that individual that you see in the middle of the picture of the slide there is the same individual that you were looking at just a few minutes earlier. The transition, the FBI was natural for me because as an FBI agent, I could continue to wear the white hat. I could continue to be one of the good guys. And once I'd been doing this for a couple of years, I wanted to push myself to the limit and see how far I could go, and I started to do undercover work. And the nature of undercover work is not exactly what you see in the films or on television. The pressures are very intense, and to the point that the psychological ramifications are significant. In the Hollywood and on the TV shows, you see on Miami Vice, you see the undercover agents driving around in Lamborghinis and wearing Gucci suits and Rolex watches and going to life-threatening meetings with dangerous cocaine cartel leaders, and then going home and having normal lives. The reality is not quite like that, and the pressures can be very intense to the point where there are a number of FBI agents doing undercover work in the early days, which I would just call like the 1970s and early 80s, were the early days of undercover operations for the FBI. And at that time, there was no structure for undercover operations. There was no training. There was no school for undercover operations, and there was minimal supervision. And there was a case in Miami which was called My Porn. All these cases have catchy titles. So, and the ones that I was involved with that we'll talk about in a little bit also had catchy titles. But My Porn is short for Miami Pornography. And the FBI agent who worked My Porn worked for 2 or 3 years, essentially full-time, with organized crime families in Miami involved in pornography, particularly child pornography. And the agent spent all his time interacting with the subjects of this case. At the time, we as agents didn't know how to limit our participation with the bad guys to the point that we wouldn't be overly involved with them and we wouldn't have overly disastrous consequences to ourselves. But Pat Livingston, who was the agent in that particular case, was deeply involved with the bad guys, socialized with them, went drinking with them, lived with them basically. And at the end of 2 years, when the case was taken down, he was reassigned to a different division, and a psychologist evaluated him and made a recommendation to the head of the office, what we call the SAC, the special agent in charge, that Pat be brought back into the office and work at a regular agent-type job to be reintegrated into the FBI culture. So management in the FBI sometimes being like management in other organizations, the special agent in charge put Pat on a special operations covert surveillance group, right, totally ignoring the advice of the psychologist. So essentially he was still doing covert work, but of a different type. After a few months, he was arrested for shoplifting. For real. So the FBI then had to decide what to do with him. And within the management, there were 2 schools of thought. One was to fire him, and the other was to get him treatment and reintegrate him and have a compassionate attitude. So again, some management sometimes being what management can be, he was fired. The end result was an appearance on 60 Minutes, a lawsuit where he was awarded $800,000, and the formation in the FBI of what's called the Undercover Safeguard Unit. And the mission of the Undercover Safeguard Unit is to monitor and to select agents to do undercover work and to monitor them when they're doing their cases. And I was part of that unit for a few years. And I just mention it to make you aware of the psychological issues involved in undercover work and of the response now that the Bureau has developed in order to protect undercover agents. Every 6 months, an undercover agent has to be evaluated. And in my case, they had maybe a pile this high of files of each evaluation they did of myself. And I always passed the evaluations because I would essentially answer the questions the way I thought they wanted them to be answered. Most full-time undercover agents know how to know the game, and also, if there's anything we didn't want, it's to be back in the office. That for us, that would be a nightmare. One of the things which I mention sometimes to give perspective, I was a full-time UC for 20 years. And within the FBI, there are about 100 agents who work undercover full-time. So for the whole United States, we're talking 100 people in a country of 300 million people. So there are not a lot. There are other agents who maybe will work an undercover case here, an undercover case there. But there aren't that many who work it full-time, day in, day out, year after year. And to give a little more perspective on what an undercover agent is, I came to realize after, and this took me nearly 2 decades, and Frank Abagnale is a good example. An undercover agent is essentially the mirror image of a con man. Or con woman, but so what is a con man, a confidence man? He's someone who uses props and lies to create an imaginary world and then target an innocent person in order to gain that innocent person's confidence and then to ultimately get that person to act against his or her best interest, mainly by parting with money and giving it to the con man. And an undercover agent is essentially the same thing, but the flip side. The undercover agent uses props and lies. Here in my case, a ponytail, gold earrings, gold necklaces, gold bracelets, a fancy car, and a fictitious background, and lies, in order to gain the confidence not of an innocent person, but in order to gain the confidence of a criminal, so that that criminal will ultimately engage in behavior with me that is to his or her detriment by allowing me to develop evidence which will ultimately lead to an arrest. So that is my short way of communicating what essentially an FBI or an undercover agent is and how it relates to a con man. Now, moving with that background, I'll start talking about one of the undercover operations I worked in, which was relevant. And most of the cases I worked in involve fraud. I mean, it's not the kind of fraud that you may be involved with routinely, but it's fraud nonetheless. And the case which you see pictured here was named Run DMV. And I don't know if any of you have, some of you get it, I can see. I have to admit it was not my creation. Dave Clark, who was one of the 2 case agents, came up with the title. And of course it's a spoof on the rap group Run DMC. So Run DMV is kind of an acronym for Run is for runners and DMV is for DMV. And the birth of the case resulted from a number of arrests. Arrests were being made by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies in New York of all types of high-level criminals, mafia figures, fugitives, terrorists, who, when they were arrested, they were found carrying identification, driver's licenses, car registrations, social security cards, sometimes green cards, which were legitimate documents. They were documents which had been issued by government agencies. They weren't forgeries. And while it might not sound initially like a big problem, it was a major crime problem because it facilitated major criminals in their efforts to carry out major criminal acts. And the best example is the terrorists in the 9/11 attacks from Al-Qaeda all had this kind of identification on them. So once a terrorist enters the country and has the driver's license, has the car registration, social security card, and other types of documentation, which is verifiable, so if they get stopped by the police for speeding or for whatever kind of control, the documents are legitimate, and then they get released and they can continue on their merry way. So once someone has that kind of documents, they can disappear into the heartland and be untraceable. So the problem was a serious one. And we were able to figure out where the documents were being generated, obviously, because, through just working back through the databases, we could see which DMV offices, for example, were issuing these driver's licenses and registrations, or which Social Security offices were issuing the Social Security cards. But we had no idea how it was being done, what the MO was. So my supervisor, Craig Dotlow, who was a big believer in undercover operations, came up with the idea of having an undercover operation targeting the world of fictitious, falsely issued, fraudulently issued documents. And I was asked to be the undercover agent for that case. And it was a fairly large-scale case. It had 2 full-time case agents, a financial analyst, and a number of other cameo players. And the way it was set up was that I would become a runner. I would become one of the middlemen who would obtain fictitious documentation. And it took about 6 months for me to get accepted into that world. The parameters, the time constraints that we have today won't allow me to get into the details of how I managed to do that. And those of you who may be interested enough to follow up can read about it in the book. But after 6 months, I had succeeded in insinuating myself among the runners. And here you see myself, and the woman on the left in the parka was another undercover agent who was making a guest appearance as helping me at the DMV in Yonkers. Most of the case was based in Yonkers and the Bronx. And the other people in the photos, for the most part, were subjects. They were middlemen who were involved in this kind of criminal and fraudulent activity, and some were also involved in other types of criminal activity. I mean, as you criminals don't, unlike us, don't just limit our activity to accounting or practicing medicine. Any way they can make $1, they'll do it. So you have people involved in all kinds of nefarious type activity. But some of these, like particularly the one I'm walking with on the right there, was actually not a bad fellow. He was he perceived what he was doing as essentially a harmless type of activity, and this was one of the risks, one of the dangers on my part. I developed a friendship with him and with some of the other runners to the point where he invited me to his wedding, and which I did not attend because I didn't want to be rubbing salt in the wounds because I knew one day he'd be arrested and he'd learn that I was the instrument of his doom. Another of the runners used to bring his 9-year-old son with him sometimes, and the son, my fictitious ID was Alex Perez. That was the name I had assumed, and his son had carved the initials AP on his skateboard and showed it to me once. And I have to tell you, driving home that evening, I didn't feel particularly proud of myself, knowing that that 9-year-old boy's dad was going to jail ultimately as a result of Uncle Alex's endeavors. But I didn't twist his arm, so I didn't feel too bad about it at the end. But I mention them because at this point, my perception of, who was the good guys, who was the bad guys was beginning to shift. And some of these guys weren't such bad guys. And I was beginning to have a more nuanced approach as to what was good and what was bad. However, there was some people who were truly on the more evil side. And there was one subject who, his name was Santiago Kuras, who was truly the nemesis, the archetypal villain that you see in a scary, ultra-violent cops and robbers movie. And Santiago Kuras was, he was taller than me. He was maybe almost 6. Well, it's not hard to be taller than me, I guess. But he was a giant of a man, 5'10" or something. But he was bulkier. He was stronger than me. And he had spiky hair, which in those days wasn't as typical as today. It was more like a sign of being a tough guy. He had spiky hair. He would wear a leather trench coat, a black leather trench coat, and he had a posse. He was the head of a posse, which is a gang. It's a slang term for a criminal gang. So, and I heard about him from the other runners, and the other runners feared him. So, from my point of view, he seemed like a good target for our investigation, and someone who would be worth getting off the street. And so, and here's a photo of myself. And Santiago Kuras is one of we don't have any really good close-up shots of him. I had heard about him and I had seen him. I saw him at the Yonkers DMV laughing. It was kind of a satanic laugh with his acolytes around him. And I thought to myself, how do I develop a relationship with someone like this? If I go up and speak to him, one of the key things about being a successful undercover agent is that one has to think and act like a criminal. If I approach him, if I initiate conversation and I don't even know the guy, I'm not acting really like a criminal. I'm acting like a cop, basically. What I decided I would do is not approach him and wait and use patience and wait till he approached me. The background I had developed for myself was that I was a fugitive from Florida who had mysteriously appeared at Yonkers. I drove a car. I had a late model Chrysler Imperial. And the car I was driving had Metro-Dade license plates on it. Now, I don't know if any of you remember from Miami Vice, but Metro-Dade is Miami, which was the cocaine capital of the United States at the time. Now, the car had never been south of Brooklyn. But the plates were genuine plates, which I had obtained as a prop. So when I would show up, I'd be driving this fancy car. There'd be plates, Metro-Date plates. I had, the photograph that you saw at the beginning, at the intro, that was the way I looked at the time. That was Alex, with the ponytail and the leather jacket. My shirt would be unbuttoned to my waist. I'd have gel in my hair. I once was in my mother's elevator that way, going to work, and scared all her neighbors. So I learned to become Alex at the office, not at home, because it was, people wonder, what did Mrs. Ruskin do to have a son like this? But in any case, with all these props, when I arrived somewhere, before I even opened my mouth, I was 90% there. People were ready to believe that I was some kind of serious bad guy. And I determined that to develop a relationship with someone like Santiago, I'd have to impress him as being more of a bad guy than he was, of being someone that he would look up to, a mentor, if you will. And it worked. The key to undercover operations, and not just in this case, and this is a good lesson, I think something that you can apply in all of you, is what I learned, and especially with someone like Santiago, was that I could develop a rapport with anybody if I could figure out what buttons to push. If I could study someone and figure out what buttons to push, and push those buttons the right way, I could develop a rapport. And with someone high and mighty, someone who's rich or poor or evil like him. And in his case, it worked. I had figured out what buttons to push. And ultimately, he approached me, and we became pals. And I would laugh at his jokes, and he would confide in me. I remember one time he told me about how his girlfriend's mother was really furious with him. And I was just, why is that? What happened? And he goes, well, she's angry that I'm going out with her daughter because the daughter is 15 years old. And so I laughed. And I was disgusted. This guy was almost 30. So I laughed, and he saw me laughing, so he goes, yeah, all my girlfriends are 15 years old. So it gives you an idea of the kind of villain he was. Moving ahead, one day he asks me if I'm interested in bills. And since we were working with fraudulent documents, I thought he meant fraudulent utility bills. Like electric bills or phone bills, which could be used to corroborate the addresses on the driver's licenses and so forth. So I said, sure, what have you got? And so he takes me over to his car and takes out an envelope, and the envelope was full of $50 bills, and the $50 bills were counterfeit. So I said, yeah, sure, I'm interested, but I got to talk to my people. My people, I always presented myself as kind of like a middle-level guy. I always had a boss, Mr. Big in Miami, who had to give me permission, authorization, which is realistic. I mean, most mid-level crooks have a Mr. Big that they got to cough up money to, and also that they have to get the blessing for. So my Mr. Big, of course, was my supervisor at the office, my FBI. So I took the $50 bill and showed it to Craig Dotlow, who's since passed away. He was a great agent. And of course, he was very interested. He called the Secret Service. The Secret Service was very interested because they knew that these $50 bills were circulating, but they hadn't been able to find the source. So the agreement we worked out with Secret Service, which was not an easy one to work out, was that they would have to wait until our case, Run DMV, was taken down before Kuras could be taken down. Because they're more like a wham-bam type of outfit. And if Kuras was to be arrested while Run DMV was still going on, then that would be the end of Alex. I'd be toast, because then my fictitious ID would be compromised. I will move ahead to we made a big purchase of counterfeit money. There were several purchases of counterfeit, and I won't go into detail, but I'll move on to the last purchase, which here we go. So the driver of the Jeep is myself. Santiago is reaching out to shake hands because we just had a meeting, and we've decided on the amount, which was a big amount. I mean, I was purchasing, I don't remember, several $100,000 worth of $50 counterfeit bills in exchange for relatively small number of real bills. And his partner, Paco, is the one that you see in front, whose faces, both faces are pixelated out. To give you an idea of the kind of people I was dealing with, Paco was being investigated by the NYPD he had a sideline. He was renting machine guns for drive-by shootings and robberies. So that's how he made extra money. Moynihan's office, as you can imagine. The final deal, and then I'll move on, so we can talk about some other cases while we still have time. The final deal was set for a small side street off of Houston Street in Manhattan, on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And at that point, I had developed my safety, my protection, my way of trying to enhance my likelihood of surviving this kind of work. I had developed a relationship with a female undercover agent, a very attractive agent who would come out as my girlfriend and my sidekick. And she was, because I had realized that surveillance can come and pick up the pieces a couple of minutes after the shooting happens. But in terms of actually enhancing your safety, having two agents in the van a block or two away is not very reassuring. So I had met this young woman, and she had agreed to work with me. She was excited about being an undercover agent, and she would wear halter tops and tease her hair and put all kinds of multicolored nail polish on, and would be totally unthreatening to the subject. And she was my eyes and ears. When I'd be meeting, she was in the car actually, in the meeting that you see in this picture. When I would be discussing and talking and negotiating with the subject, she'd be chewing gum, looking like a bimbo, but in reality, she was looking around. And we had a code, and I'll explain that in a second. For example, if she'd say, "Alex, I'm getting bored," that would mean something bad's going on. There's actors on the scene that shouldn't be here. And so I would then be aware that I'd have to take some kind of actions to either start extricating ourselves or at least be aware of who the other players were. And it happened a few times with Kuras, that there'd be other people, that he would bring his own surveillance people basically to make sure we were on the up and up, or that there wasn't anybody investigating us, for example. For typical meets, what she would do is when we would pull up and the subject would show up, she'd jump out of the front passenger seat and sit behind the subject as a kind of courtesy so he could be talking directly with me. It was actually a safety precaution. When she would be behind the subject, the code we had was, if I called her honey, she was to shoot the guy. No question, just, I wouldn't call her honey under any other circumstances. And I trusted that she would do it. I mean, we had a very strong, well, we didn't tell our supervisors or our bosses. We certainly didn't tell the U.S. Attorney's Office people about that. My belief was, and still is, that I'd rather survive and try and explain it afterwards than not survive and have a clean, everything be above, correct and above board. At the meet, the big meet with on this little side street in a crummy neighborhood, we were set up, she was sitting next to me, and the Jeep that you see here was virtually bristling with weapons. I mean, I had a 10mm pistol in a fanny pack. Under the armrest, there was a 9mm pistol. She had a pistol in her purse, and in the glove compartment, there was another handgun. So the car was and then behind me was a bulletproof vest with a blanket covering it up. When he showed up so quickly that she didn't have time to get in back. And he jumped in the back and was sitting directly behind me and sitting on the bulletproof vest. So it was a very stressful meet, to say the least. One of many stressful meets, I have to say, with Kuras. And but it came to a successful conclusion. Paco was pacing nervously up and down in front of the car. He was not happy at all. Kuras was fine. Once the transaction was completed, I was to say, I'll see you when I get back from Miami, which was the code for the Secret Service agents and FBI agents to swoop in and arrest everybody, which they did. Kuras ran out of the car, started running away, but didn't get very far. Paco was in cuffs pretty quickly. And I had arranged that I was being arrested as well. Myself and Alice, my girlfriend, we were all to be arrested. So word came when it got out that of the arrest, that it wouldn't look like I had been a snitch or UC. And the one thing I had emphasized to the Secret Service, though, is before you don't cuff me until you've already cuffed Kuras and Paco. Because the one thing I didn't want to have happen was for me to be running around like a chicken with my hands behind my back once the gunfire started going, once they started exchanging. So I told them, throw me down in the car, yell all kinds of obscenities at me. In case we're taping here, I won't say what kind of obscenities they yelled at me. But those of you who are familiar with the Secret Service know that they know how to use obscenities when appropriate, or when they believe it's appropriate. And then once Kuras was being transported, the Secret Service agents who transported him had been coached. They were pretending to speak among each other. They were saying, "Oh yeah, that Cuban guy, he's being taken to the airport because he's being extradited directly to Miami, where there's a warrant out for him." So that Kuras, not being a genius nor an attorney, would at least get the point that there's a reason I'm not in court with him, so that word wouldn't get out that I had been involved in this, and it worked. So that was an example. And I mention it in part because we're talking about the gray area between black and white. There is a lot of gray area, but there's also in some cases, there's a lot of black. And Kuras was an example of a lot of black. There wasn't much gray. So when we talk about nuances between right and wrong and the gray area in between, I like to tell his story because it's a reminder that in some cases it's pretty black. Now, moving back to something that might be more familiar to some of you, another case that I worked on, completely different and with no comparison to Run DMV, involved commodities fraud. So I spent a year and a half becoming a commodities broker. And one reason I like to juxtapose this case with the Run DMV is that at least in Run DMV, the crime was on a personal level. It was face-to-face. At least the criminals were confronting the people that they were engaged with in criminal behavior. In this case, which was called Comcor, for commodities corruption, the criminals and the other white-collar criminals that were related were involved in fraud on an enormous level. And without being confronted face-to-face with their victims, they were able to commit their criminal fraudulent acts and feel essentially no remorse. And the level of crime, when you're defrauding thousands of annuitants out of their life savings, is way, in my perception at least, is way worse than the guy who invited me to his wedding, who's doing this kind of like low-level, white-collar, low-level corrupt activity. These people on Wall Street were involved in acts where if they lost sleep at night, it wasn't because they had defrauded people and because they had stolen their retirements. If they lost sleep at night, it's because they were worried about the next day's fluctuations in the price of a gold contract or a crude oil contract. Okay, so we're running, okay. So I won't go into great detail, but as to how this case proceeded, but after a year undercover on the floor of the commodities exchange, I had reached the point where I passed the test to become a broker. I was working as a clerk, and I passed the test. I was going to have my own seat on the exchange. And a few days prior to having that seat, I was exposed by someone who recognized me on the floor of the exchange. And the woman who recognized me was an attorney who worked on the regulatory arm of the exchange. And she had been an assistant DA with me in Brooklyn. And instead of coming up to me on the floor of the exchange, and the floor was like in, these were old-fashioned the pits, like in trading places with the millions of people screaming. Instead of coming up to me and saying, "Mark, what are you doing here? What's going on?" She went to her bosses and said, "I think that guy's a federal agent." And I tried to bluff it out. I've written the story, and I think I came close, but ultimately the case had to be taken down, and I was toast. And it brings an interesting, there's an ethical issue here. She was working for the exchange, so did she do the right thing by telling her bosses, or would the right thing have been to come to me and to try and find out what was going on? I worked a number of other cases over the years. These two were Malaysian heroin traffickers talking to me negotiating a heroin deal. And then the last two cases I'll quickly make reference to because each one has a different ethics issue involved. This one involved a sting that we set up where 3 veteran detectives were stealing. When they were conducting raids, they would normally steal 1/3 of what they seized. And we had learned about this, and we set up an elaborate sting, which ultimately resulted, as you can see, in their arrest and recovery of the money that we had planted and which they had stolen. It's a fascinating case, and if I come back next year, I'll tell you that story. And then one more, I'll make a quick reference to, because I just want to hit each of the types of fraud and ethical type of issues that I had to deal with. And this was my last case as an FBI agent. It was my swan song, if you will. And it involved, these were the defendants. These were the defendants, Hasidic Orthodox rabbis. And the way we set up this case, it would take me another hour to tell you about it, but what they were doing, Orthodox Jews have to, in order to get a divorce, a woman has to obtain what's called a get, G-E-T, from her husband, which is a kind of a letter consenting to the divorce. And there were Orthodox husbands who were refusing to provide bitterly, they were refusing to provide their wives or ex-wives with a get. And what these rabbis had a business, in exchange for $40,000, $50,000, they would have the recalcitrant husband kidnapped, tortured with cattle prods, literally, until they signed the get. This was an unusual case. Now, I'm going to conclude, and then I'd like you ask a few questions, but in this world of shifting moral buoys and ethical standards shifting and difficulty in terms of determining what is ethical and what is not, I just want to close with the quote from Hamlet, where Polonius is saying to Laertes, his son, who is going off to study in Paris. And Laertes gives this advice to his son. He says, "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." So that's my advice to you in terms of determining a moral compass. If you're true to yourself, and you know in your heart when you're being true to yourself, then you're on the right track. And if anybody accuses you of wrongdoing or whatever, if you know that if you followed Laertes' advice, Polonius' advice, and you've been true to yourself, your moral compass will be true, and you will succeed at what you seek to accomplish. Thank you.